When discussing RBE-type communities, a question that often comes up in discussion when it comes to the topic of transition is where exactly do we start? Welcome. Today we will be discussing the first preliminary steps that we need to take in order to transition into an RBE-type community-based society. Transition will be a recurring theme throughout this year's videos, because I really want to cover what each stage of a transition might look like. Before I proceed further, we need to actually ask the question, where do we start? Or more aptly, how can we start? And to begin answering that question, I think it's important to take a look at our current position as advocates, as communities, as individuals, etc. Right now, the vast majority of people do not have that much influence over their economy or their society. Economic power and social capital are concentrated into the hands of states and large multinationals, for the most part. Economically speaking, you may have some control over your consumption habits. However, that's pretty negligible when you take a look at the rest of the picture. You may have some control over the things you use, but what you don't have control over is where that thing comes from, how it is produced, where it is produced, among many other variables. When it comes to food, for example, you have no control over whether the food you buy is produced or grown domestically or abroad, what processes are used in production and distribution, using what resources, and so on. Bringing this kind of power and autonomy back to people and communities is something I want to cover in this episode. However, the first thing I wanted to cover today is awareness. We can talk about raising awareness from a variety of different angles, whether it be raising awareness of the society and the system we currently live in, whether it be introducing people to ideas like community and RBEs, or what have you. Although, what's crucial when communicating all this to people is the breaking down of what's known as social inertia. And the first step of going about that is you need to establish a need, specifically a need for radical change. Many social movements, when communicating their ideas to people, will often give a moral argument for why people should be a part of their movement. This might be sufficient within the context of a communal society and is a necessary argument regardless. However, because of the hyper-individualism we experience today, a moral argument is not enough. Within the context of the society we live in order to establish a need for change, we must also raise awareness of what affects individuals and communities directly and how so. Simply put, people need to be aware of how the current system influences their lives and also how a radically different system might improve their circumstances. But what needs to be made clear in order for this to succeed is what realistic steps and methods will be used in order to get from where we are now to where we want to be. Otherwise, the changes and ideas we are advocating might come across as unrealistic and unfounded. Once a need has been established when communicating these ideas, the next step is to communicate methods of engagement. This is the point where people say, okay, I get the idea, now what do I do as part of this movement, this transition? And this point is kind of meta because that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about for the remainder of this video. A key theme here is about empowering people and bringing them closer together, whether that be socially, economically, or culturally. And while it might not do much in the long run, here is where we can start. Firstly, let's look at what people can do with the little power they actually have. By supporting small businesses and non-profits as opposed to large corporates, people are able to direct a small amount of wealth closer to home. Why would they want to do this? Well, there are two main reasons. One is that small companies are often less alienated from their communities than larger ones. An owner of a smaller company is much more likely to come into contact with regular people, and while this might not translate into empathy for the community which that business is part of, smaller businesses are much more likely to see the direct impact their enterprise has on people, and for some businesses this might translate into more ethical practices, which is true for some but is not always the case. The second reason why people might want to support smaller, more local enterprise is that it brings the means of production closer to communities. And the benefit of this is that since more people from one community would work for a local business if there was an opportunity for that, more people within a local community would have greater access to a means of production, which gives the possibility of enabling some of the things I will talk about in this video. One of the first steps we can take to ready people for a transition into an RBE is to introduce them to the idea of access. And this can be done through a variety of methods. An idea that's been around for quite a while now is the tool library, places where people can go to access a variety of equipment and then return it after use. Now today these are often people's businesses, and so they will charge a rent for access to an item. However, as a step in transition, it would be more ideal to set up tool libraries that gradually reduce pricing over time, with the eventual goal of eliminating it altogether and moving towards different forms of economics. Other ways of introducing access into communities could be through initiatives such as community fridges, allotments, and things of that nature. Something which the so-called sharing economy hasn't quite caught on to yet is the food sector. So the ideas that I have previously mentioned would be nice to see if implemented on a large scale. Introducing the concept of access over ownership into our communities would be empowering for people, because it would provide them with partially autonomous sustenance and would provide them with access to tools that enable them to carry out work that they would previously not be able to do. And this will aid the transition, because it would be a small step in reducing people's reliance on the capitalist world. I wanted to talk about makerspaces for a second, because I think they have a lot of potential. Traditionally, they have strong connotations with the open source movement, and both have grown in popularity over time. This is encouraging. It means that more people are coming together, collaborating with one another, and sharing their ideas. These are also good places to gain knowledge and insight in a variety of disciplines, including coding, electronics, systems design, and so on. What would be nice to see is for people who are interested in the transition towards an RBE to start their own maker/hacker spaces within their local areas. It would be great if more makery types were introduced to the idea of an RBE, because I think these people could bring a lot of technical skills to the table. Not to mention that between RBE advocates and makers or hackers or people in the open source community, there is a slight shared overlap in ethos, which I think is not quite yet recognised, and it would be good if this was honed in on. By extension, there are multiple ways in which RBE advocates can reach out to the wider public, especially young people. For example, you could have social clubs or groups where people come to do activities and share their interests with others, whether that be gaming, computing, cooking, sports. Even makerspaces could be incorporated as well. Within these groups, ideas like access over ownership and gift exchange could be introduced, and this could foster a new mindset of community and reciprocity. Finally, one of the most important aspects of moving away from the current system and building the base for a transition is for people to move progressively towards self-sufficiency, primarily at an individual level, but eventually at a community level as well. At an individual level, there would likely be different stages of self-sufficiency. At a novice level, this could mean learning to cook, or perhaps learning basic repairs of various appliances and devices. And at a more advanced level, we could talk about things like growing your own food, producing your own goods for use, as opposed to their monetary value, generating your own energy, and eventually doing some home recycling. The resources gained from such could be used in the personal production of other things. Of course, the people who do this will first need to learn a range of subjects, from agriculture to engineering to IT and logic, electronics, plumbing, and if these people value their time, they will eventually want to start thinking about automation, and so they will need to gain knowledge of the prerequisite topics in order to begin automating some processes. And this will require a change of mindset away from this inertia that we experience today and towards attitudes that are more conducive to change, to learning, and to community, if we are indeed to scale this up in the future to the community level. But once we have this self-sufficiency, it could be really empowering for people, because it gives them direct control over their sustenance and to an extent over their production. And this can make the transition into an RBE much more viable, as I will explain in future installments. The other benefit of people becoming more self-sufficient is that it provides more resilience during turbulent times. Case in point, the current global situation that we find ourselves in. The autonomy and resilience that self-sufficiency provides could potentially also have a stabilizing effect on society in the short term. There are many other benefits to self-sufficiency, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Perhaps it's worth noting that all these things I've talked about are not actually part of the transition, but are just preliminary steps that we need to take if we are to create a feasible and realistic path for a transition into an RBE. Before we even think about a transition, people must be empowered so that they have the knowledge, the capabilities and the tools they need, and they have the collaborative force that's needed in order to make a transition happen. This isn't going to be easy. A transition into an RBE is going to require a lot of time, energy, and collaborative work in order to be realised. But if we want a better tomorrow, then it will be effort well spent. In the next installment of this series, we will cover the beginning of the transition into an RBE. I will go over expanding our self-sufficiency from the individual to the peer-to-peer level and eventually to the community level, and we'll also discuss approaches for forming the first prototype communities. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you want to find out more about community and RBEs, then check out my other content. If you want to help the channel grow and gain exposure, then make sure to subscribe and share content such as this episode. Anyway, that's all from me. I'm Adam, signing off. Stay safe, and I'll catch you all next time.